Hey there, and welcome to the Beginner's Garden podcast. We are settling into summer, and in mid-July now, it is hot outside. But believe it or not, now is the time that we need to start thinking about our fall gardens. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through which crops you actually need to start indoors in the next couple of weeks, even though I know it feels like summer has only just started. These are the ones that catch most gardeners off guard, especially if you're new to fall garden planting. We'll talk about which crops need a head start, when to start them, and a few simple tips to help you have healthy transplants when it's finally time to move them outside. I'm also going to share with you the biggest problem that I have personally seen in my friends' gardens that often brings about so much disappointment. I want to save you from that because it is so easy to prevent once you know about it. But before we get started with the fall crops that you need to know about in July, what if you want a fall garden, but you don't feel like you have the time or energy to actually plan it all out? And what if I told you you don't have to? I'm opening a brand new fall garden planning concierge service, and this is for the gardener who wants to grow a fall garden, but wants someone else to plan out all the details. I'll meet with you on Zoom, learn about your space and your goals, and then I will create a completely customized garden plan just for you. This includes what to plant, when to plant it, and exactly where it should go in your garden. You'll also get a follow-up Zoom session with me so that I can walk you through the plan, plus email support for the fall season. No more guessing, no more Googling, no more wondering if you're doing it right. And if even shopping for seeds and supplies feels overwhelming to you right now, you can choose an optional add-on where I'll do the shopping for you and you'll have everything delivered right to your door. Now, this is a brand new service and it's a beta round, so I'm limiting it to gardeners in zones 6 through 8, 6, 7, and 8, and I'm only taking 10 people total. This is so I can make sure and focus on each person's garden and I can deliver you a garden plan that works best for you. So the earlier you sign up, the more likely you are to get one of those spots and the sooner that your garden plan will be ready for you. My goal is to have these all delivered by August 1st, if not a week or two before. If you're interested in this and want to learn more about it, head to journeywithjill.net/planmygarden to grab your spot. I'll take care of the rest so that you can enjoy your best fall garden yet. Let's start talking about why I am even talking to you today about fall gardening when we barely just got past the 4th of July holiday for those of you in the US. It seems like summer has just begun, and yes, now I'm talking to you about the fall. So here's why it's important to understand that now is the time to begin thinking about fall gardening. And that is, we want our cool season crops to mature in cool weather, not necessarily plant them in cool weather. By starting some of these now, not all of them, we'll talk about which ones to start inside now, but most of them will probably be started either in July or August, depending on what the crop is. But starting these now ensures that they will mature before the waning daylight slows growth and the coldest weather hits. This is something I didn't understand as a new gardener. I just thought planting a fall garden meant planting in the fall when it started getting cool. And I also thought my biggest threat to my fall crops was going to be the cold. And for sure, the cooler the temperature, the more our plants' growth slows. But I did not understand as a beginning gardener how critical the shortening of days is to the growth of those crops too. It's amazing how our growth of our plants slows as we head into fall. Just like it's amazing how quickly our plants grow when we're headed into summer. Once you realize that, you'll start noticing it more and more. By starting now, we ensure that our plants are going to mature before the waning daylight slows the growth and the cold weather hits. The biggest mistake that I see new gardeners make, and I see it online, but I see it in person with my friends, is starting these crops too late. And here's the problem. The crops do not have enough day length to be able to grow at the pace that is normal for them, and so they don't mature before the cold sets in. In my climate, what this means is that carrots or spinach or whatever I plant, now those aren't the ones we're going to be starting indoors in July, but those in particular, if we plant them too late, then you'll have these beautiful spinach sprouts or these beautiful carrot greens, but they don't form before the cold weather sets in. And then many times, especially with carrots, then they don't end up maturing at all. Spinach will overwinter. That's probably a bad example just because in my zone 8A, that's actually the great thing because spinach will overwinter and grow again in the spring. But that's not going to be the case with a lot of the crops. And let's take broccoli. We'll talk about that today. If we don't get broccoli planted early enough, it won't have enough time to form a head before it gets too cold for it to grow and before the day length completely goes to where it's not going to grow anymore. So that's the biggest mistake, is starting too late. And it's not that the plants are going to die as much as they just won't get mature in time, depending on your climate. Another reason that we're talking about fall gardening, and I've got lots of podcasts on fall gardening and the benefits to that, but if you're getting tired already with your summer garden, if you're battling disease and battling pests and man, it's just hot outside and you just want to be inside in the air conditioning, then let me encourage you to take a few extra steps and to plan to have a fall garden. You're going to be dealing with fewer pests as we get into the cooler weather, sweeter flavors of many of these crops. If you harvest carrots, for example, in the fall after it starts to frost, those carrots are going to be more tasty than the ones in the spring. And then you get an extended harvest. One benefit of the waiting daylight hours is that because the crop's growth slows and eventually stalls, you basically for a period of time will have nature as your refrigerator. Your crops can stay out there much longer. For example, in the spring, when I'm planting broccoli, as soon as that broccoli gets ready to harvest, I've got to cut it or else it's going to start to flower, bolt. It's not going to be good quality. Broccoli in my fall garden can stay out there for weeks and still be okay. Of course, all of this depends on your different climate and how your winter comes and whether it comes early or late or, lots of different factors there. But the whole point is you can have your crops in your garden longer. And so you're able to have a longer harvest for your fall crops than you would have had those same crops in the spring. With that in mind, let's talk about the first crops that you want to plant. And specifically, you're going to start these indoors in July. These are crops that need more time to mature and they benefit from indoor seed starting. And we'll talk about why and how some of these can actually be directly sown in the garden, but why you might want to choose to start them indoors when we talk about each individual one. There's lots of different options here, but these are the ones that if you plan on growing them in the fall garden, I recommend that you consider starting these inside from seed. Number one, as I mentioned, is broccoli. Broccoli is one of those that it really benefits from a lot of sunlight in the fall. I know a lot of people think that cool season crops like the shade. That is true in the summer, but that is not overall true in the fall. Remember, we're getting less sun. So broccoli, even cauliflower, cabbage, those crops benefit from as much sun as you can give them. And that sunlight, you're going to get more if you plant it earlier in the garden in the year. And to do that, you'll need to start them from seed indoors. They are going to need time to head up. Now, I've had broccoli and cauliflower do just fine. They're fairly cold tolerant. They usually last, at least in my garden, till about the upper 20s in the garden. And sometimes I do cover those with row covers. Cabbage I have found to be more resilient. It will last a little bit longer. But those are ones that if you start them from seed indoors in July, they'll be ready to plant out in your garden in August at some point. And then you will have time for those to mature before it gets too cold in most climates. Brussels sprouts is another. It takes longer to mature. Brussels sprouts, honestly, I've never really had a lot of success with that. I don't know if it's a summer thing. I don't know if it's a southern thing, but I have started them indoors in July and I was never able to get a great harvest. They probably would have needed to be started a little bit earlier, to be honest. But honestly, our family doesn't eat enough Brussels sprouts for me to figure out the magic timing for that in my climate. Okay, so the ones I just mentioned, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, Chinese cabbage, kohlrabi, those are ones that I recommend that you start them from seed indoors just in general. They need to be started from seed indoors. But there are some that I'm going to share with you next that they can actually be directly sown in the garden. Their seeds can be directly sown, but they may benefit from indoor seed starting, giving them a head start too. And here are a few reasons why. Even with these crops that could be directly sown, if you start them from seed indoors early, it will reduce the heat stress on the seedlings. So if you think about it, you can get a head start on these and start a little bit earlier so that you can get a quicker harvest, and you don't have to plant them by transplant in July, and then they would have to suffer through a lot of the heat. Instead, start them early, plant them from transplant in later August, and then they will have reduced heat stress during that time of year. Another thing, and to me this is a big thing, is it protects from pest pressure. I have found that in the later part of the summer, there is heavy activity of pests. Now, I know I mentioned that fall gardening typically will have fewer pests. That's more when it starts getting cooler. But when you're planting these crops in the ground in August, I know grasshoppers are terrible that time of year. There's lots of pests that have not gone into hibernation yet. I'm not sure if that's the actual correct word, but you know what I mean. They're still out there. So if you're starting something from seed, and I've had this happen many times, and the seed sprouts just fine in the garden, but those seedlings are so little, they are perfect for pests to prey on, whether it's grasshoppers or rabbits or whatever. But if you start them from seed indoors and then you transplant them as a sturdy, larger plant, then it's going to be able to withstand pest pressure better. Of course, covering with an insect netting is always the best idea anyway, but having those stronger when they are actually in the garden is beneficial. And then another thing that you can do is, let's say you do want to direct sow greens or lettuce in the garden, in the fall garden a little bit later, which is definitely what I do. You can start a first round of a succession planting inside. That way you can continue to stagger your greens so you can get lettuce for longer, or greens of some sort for longer. So you could actually start the first succession from seed indoors and then a month later start directly sowing them in the ground. Examples of these that you can direct sow but benefit from indoor seed starting for the reasons I just said would be kale, collard greens, Swiss chard, and lettuce. Now, let me go back to Swiss chard real quick, because a benefit of Swiss chard is that it actually tolerates heat and cold well. So if you are in kind of a transition period of your garden where maybe some summer crop came out and it's not quite time for your fall crops, Swiss chard would be a good one to put in there. It's more tolerant of heat, but it also handles cold well. Next, let's move on to lettuce, because this is what I love to do. Is I love to plant lettuce in the fall garden, but like I do with my spring lettuce, I try to choose which varieties I plant at certain times. For example, for my early lettuce, I'm going to plant a variety that's more heat tolerant, because if I'm going to be planting lettuce out in my garden, let's say I'm planting it from seed mid-July, I'm transplanting it in mid-August, it's still very hot in Arkansas in mid-August, I'm going to want to plant a variety like Muir, or I tried a new one this year called Hampton Easy Leaf that was very tolerant of spring heat. So that's probably another one that I would want to plant in the first part of like the later part of the summer. But then as we go into the fall time of year, I'll want to switch to planting a more cold tolerant lettuce like Tango or Winter Density. And there's definitely, variations in between, but I like to time that on when is it going to be in the garden? When is it going to mature? And am I going to choose a type that's a little bit more suited for whatever temperature it's going to mature in? And that leads me to a next level tip. And this applies to no matter what fall crop you're talking about, is variety matters. You'll notice that many of these same crops are the ones that you probably already planted in your spring garden. But if you want to get even better as a fall gardener, choose varieties that are more suited for fall gardening. You'll see this labeled on the seed catalog, and it'll say something like quick maturing or shorter days to harvest. They will also say something like cold tolerant or great for storing. You'll just see these little blips in a seed catalog that gives you an indication that they're good for fall and winter growing. Don't choose one unless you're choosing an early lettuce, but don't choose one that says resists bolting, because if it says it resists bolting, that means it's good for heat, right? So we want to, especially as we're going into the fall and winter, we want to choose a variety that's more cold tolerant than it is heat tolerant. You'll also notice on seed catalogs that they'll say if a variety is specifically suited for fall planting or specifically suited for overwintering, or it may even say, hey, this performs better in cooler temperatures. Now, that's not to say that you can't use the same seeds that you used in the spring. You can. There are definitely some varieties that I plant in both, but a higher level best practice, especially if you're not a beginner anymore, is to look for varieties that are better suited for each season, and you'll have more success with that. Next, let's talk about timing. Now, this is a big discussion that I'm only just going to touch on, but what you want to do is you want to plan when you plant with your first frost in mind. So go to Google, ChatGPT, whatever you want to do, and look up what is my average first frost date in the fall, put in your zip code, and then you'll want to count backwards. Usually about 10 to 12 weeks is when you will plant seeds indoors. Let me give you an example of broccoli. My average first frost in the fall is November 1st. 12 weeks would be August 1st if we're talking about starting from seed indoors, but you always want to add 2 weeks to that to account for the waning fall daylight. Because remember, less daylight is going to mean that these crops are not going to grow as fast. So you'll always want to count an additional 2 weeks when you're counting backwards from your first fall frost. So that really is what you're going to look at with these indoor seeds starting. And for most of us, and even I've seen gardeners that are, further in the north, they seem to plant their fall crops about the same time I do, maybe a little earlier. But July is a pretty standard of planting fall crops from seed indoors. Definitely double check for your frost, but that's a pretty good blanket. Let's start around then. There are some things, though, that you want to keep in mind when you're indoor seed starting in the summer. Number one is keep your seeds cool. This is why we do it indoors. Indoor temperatures and AC are our friends because remember, these crops are cool season crops. They want to grow in the cold weather. You're definitely not going to need a seedling heat mat. I never use that for cool season crops anyway. They don't need it. But indoor temperatures, AC is ideal. Also, lighting is essential. Use grow lights just like you would for your indoor seeded crops that you seed in January or February or March. Now, I have had people ask me, could I indoor seed start but do it outside? And so bear with me. This is the thought. The thought is, I don't have grow lights. Could I do the same thing but use the sunlight? So here's why this may be problematic, is that it is so hot outside this time of year. Remember, these are cool season crops. They're going to struggle to grow if the soil gets too hot. And if you're indoor seed starting and you're starting in these cells, the soil is going to get really hot really fast. Not only that, but it's going to dry out. That's going to make it hard for you to keep water in there so that the seeds can sprout. Well, you might think, well, can I put a shade cloth on it to be able to cool it down? Well, you could, but remember, these seedlings need light. That's why we have grow lights, is because they need to have as much light as possible when they're first starting to sprout. And if you put a shade cloth on there, they're not getting as much light as they need. So this would definitely be something that I would discourage. I'm not saying that it couldn't work, but I just don't see a reason why that could be the best case scenario, as opposed to planting them indoors with the AC under grow lights that are going to help that plant get off to the strongest start. And these plants need to be strong because you're going to be planting them in the heat of summer still. So they need to be strong, they need to be resilient, and the best way to start that is indoors under grow lights. Don't forget your airflow, getting some kind of a fan going to prevent any kind of fungal damping off disease. If you are new to indoor seed starting, This is definitely the same skills that you would use even if you're starting from seed indoors in the early spring. And if you're new to this and you want to start for the first time, or if you want to get better at it, I wanted to let you know that I do have a workshop that's called the Beginner's Guide to Indoor Seed Starting. We're actually offering it for $10 off. It's a replay of a workshop that I've done in January in the past, and it's only $19 to get this replay if you use the code SUMMER25. This code's good through the whole month of July, but if you are doing any indoor seed starting and you want to do that, check out the show notes and we'll get you a link to that. That way you could start your seeds off right. Next, we're going to be talking about what comes next when you want to plant your crops in the garden, how to harden them off, and how to get them acclimated to the warmth. But first, I want to thank our sponsor for this week's episode, Organic Rev. By the middle of the summer, that's now, the heat is cranking up and our plants are starting to feel it. The soil is drying out faster, the nutrients are getting used up, and the stress of our plants is starting to show. That's why I love using Organic Rev, not only at planting, but I also use it all season long, especially in the summer. Rev is a sustainable way to reboot your soil and keep your garden thriving all season long. It helps roots pull more nutrients from tired soil, keeping plants green and photosynthesizing at full strength, and it builds resilience to help with heat, pests, and drought. When I see a plant starting to struggle, or I know we're going into a major hot spell, I'll water in some Rev, an ounce to a gallon, to support health and reduce the stress on the plant. And then when I start planting late season crops like we're talking about today, I will dip the root ball in a 50-50 mixture of Organic Rev to water, because I know that getting those roots off to a strong start is the key to a strong harvest. If you want to reboot your soil and energize your garden, do it the sustainable way by using Organic Rev. You can visit organicrev.com and use my code Jill10 to save 10% off of your order. Okay, we've started our seeds indoors. Now, what comes next? These crops are going to be transplanted in the late summer. This is typically going to be, in my climate, about mid to late August, but a lot of times what will happen, especially when we're starting in the middle of July, is that many of these crops will need to be potted up, especially if it's still too hot to plant out in the garden. And I'll tell you, my rule of thumb is usually I want to wait until the outside temperatures have dropped into the 80s. Even if it's the upper 80s, I don't really like planting these cool season crops outside in the 90s unless I have to. And if I have to, I'll try to plant it. Well, anyway, I try to plant it in the evening just to keep them from being stressed when they first get planted from the heat of the sun. And then I'll put a shade cloth on them immediately. But I try to look at the forecast and try to choose a time where we get this cold, I hate to say cold spell when it's in the 80s, but in August, that is a cool spell. Everybody's happy about it. But usually we'll get some kind of dip, and that's when I'm like, okay, this is the time to put them in. But if something happens and I'm not able to get them in the ground, it's just still too hot, I may need to pot them up. And honestly, with these crops such as broccoli and cabbage, that's more beneficial anyway, because if I can transfer them from a smaller cell into a larger pot, like a 4-inch pot, they can get even stronger in that pot. And that way they're more resilient when they get into the garden because they're a stronger plant. They've got stronger root systems. I always use Organic Rev when I'm transplanting because I've seen that helps. I believe I first used Organic Rev in the fall garden, and that's when I first saw such a difference. But all that to say, potting up is still something that we might want to do. And I do mention that in the seed starting workshop. If you're interested in that, I show you how to do that. But before you actually put your crops into the garden, you want to make sure to harden them off, because you are going from an indoor situation of 72, 76 degrees to an outdoor temperature of 80s and maybe 90s. They need to be acclimated to that. And not only to the temperature, but to the sun. The sun is stronger than grow lights. And so we need to acclimate them. What I like to do is I like to take them outside, put them in the shade for a couple of hours just to get them starting to acclimate to the heat, bring them back inside. And then one day I'll take them out, and then I'll put them in the sun for 30 minutes. And the next day in the sun for an hour. And then just continuing to put them out for smaller increments every day to get them acclimated to the heat and to the sun. And then once I decide to put them in the garden, once I realize it's time, then I will almost always plant them and then put a shade cloth over them. What I want to make sure to do, I've made this mistake before, is I want to make sure there's plenty of airflow. A lot of times I will keep the north side of the plants open completely so that there can be some airflow there. The sun is not going to be shining in the north in general. I'll put it on top, of course, but I'll keep the north side open. And then a lot of times I'll keep the east and west side open also for airflow, because I've made the mistake of shading the entire garden area, and then that will just trap heat and it cooked my plants. So I want to make sure to keep airflow. But I'm not going to keep the shade cloth on all the time, like for weeks and weeks on end, because there is a tipping point where I need to get the shade cloth off so the plants can have access to full sun. Because yes, I want the shade cloth on to help them acclimate and to protect them from heat, to keep the soil cooler, all of that. But at some point, and usually it's in September, usually early to mid-September, I want to get the shade cloth off if I can, or as much as possible, to get them acclimated to the sun. Sometimes that means just putting the shade cloth on top and then letting like the morning sun be able to get into the plants, but the hot middle of the sun gets shaded a little bit. It just kind of depends on what your situation is. But I want to get it off as soon as I can, as soon as it's smart, so that the plants can get more sun. I have tested this in my garden. I've had other people test this in their gardens. And we have all found, especially with some of these broccoli and cabbage in particular, we've found that the sooner we can get the shade cloth off when it's safe to do so, the more rapid growth we see and the better harvest that we get. So keep that in mind. Now, many direct sow crops like carrots, beets, radishes, they will be planted next. They're usually planted about the same time as we are transplanting the crops that we started indoors. And that's what we're going to cover more in depth later in July. So today I just really wanted to focus on the crops that we wanted to indoor start now, because we need to get them a good 4 to 6 week start ahead of our direct sow crops. That's why I wanted to talk about this today. That way you know what you want to do if you want to start these from seed indoors. Now, if you know you want broccoli, you know you want cabbage, some of these that we've already talked about, but you're not going to indoor start, then I would recommend, if you don't know yet, call around to some nurseries and see if they offer transplants. Around the middle of August, 1st of September, that is generally a good time to start planting these. Double check your own climate. But if you're not going to start these indoors, then in many cases you can find transplants. Not all places have this available. I know I've talked to a lot of students in the past where they didn't have it available in their location. I know we do. So this may be something you may want to ask. And if you can't find any of these crops available as transplants, then you may want to make the decision to do some indoor seed starting, especially if you want these in the fall. You want them harvested in the fall. So just to wrap up here, again, it may feel early, it may feel hot, but it's so important to get these seeds started now, because it will set you up for a fall garden you'll actually enjoy. I know it's a lot of work, and I know it's hard to explain to you how much you'll be thankful that you did do this when you start harvesting these crops in October, November, for me, even December and January, just depending on your climate. You'll be really grateful that you did. And finally, I wanted to remind you of 3 resources that you might be interested in. One is we're going to be having a live Q&A coaching call tomorrow on July 9th. If you have any questions, whether they're fall gardening questions or specific gardening questions, this is Tuesday, July 9th at 12 Central. Dream to Garden students are already invited. Check your email inbox for that Zoom link. But if you're not a Dream to Garden student, you can come for $15. You'll be able to ask your question live, even submit one ahead of time if you can't make it and you need to watch the replay. I'll leave a link in the show notes for that. Also, don't forget, if you're interested in seed starting, our seed starting workshop is $10 off. Just use code SUMMER25. Again, the link for that is in the show notes. And if you don't want to mess with any of this fall garden planning, if you just want me to do it for you, if you want a fall garden, but you don't want the stress of planning it yourself, you can grab one of 10 spots available for my fall garden planning concierge service. This is a beta for those who are in zone 6 through 8. You go to journeywithjill.net/planmygarden to try to grab one of those spots, and I'll do all the planting for you. So you don't have to, but you can still do the planting and the growing and get a fall garden this year. So check out those options in the show notes if any of those sound like what you need right now for this season. And hang in there, because in a few weeks, we're going to be talking about direct sowing your fall crops. But until then, I'll see you again next week on another episode of the Beginner's Garden Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll chat with you again next week.